Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and this is the Autoimmune Protocol Lecture Series, Week 2, Lecture 4, The Importance of Offal and Broth. We've talked a lot about how nutrients are really important for immune health and how there are frequent flyer foods that just tend to be super sources of the most important nutrients, but also complete and balanced nutrition. We've talked about vegetables, we've talked about seafood, and really, for most people, that's an easy sell. It is a lot of vegetables, more vegetables than people are used to. Maybe you're not used to eating shellfish on a weekly basis, but it's not as intimidating as what we're about to talk about, which is organ meat. So I want to preface this entire lecture with, please keep an open mind, because organ meat really is some of the most nutrient-dense food on the planet. And when you were looking at how deficiencies can relate to autoimmune disease and which foods were the most rich sources of those important immune health nutrients, organ meat was the most common food, especially liver. So let's get into detail about that, and let's talk about that in a way where I want you to separate out whatever preconceived notions you have about the flavor of liver and just think about how this food can contribute to health. You know, studies show that there are nutrients that we get from plant foods that are essential that we really can't get from animal foods, and vice versa. And when it comes to animal foods, organ meat really is the king. Liver is one of the most concentrated food sources of vitamin A, which we saw that vitamin A deficiency can be a precursor for autoimmune disease. It's also an outstanding source of vitamin D, vitamin B12, as well as all the other B vitamins, copper, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, manganese, and iron. Kidney, which is also a pretty easy to find organ meat, is particularly high in vitamin B12, selenium, iron, copper, phosphorus, and zinc. Heart is the most concentrated food source of coenzyme Q10, which is a very powerful cardioprotective, vascular protective nutrient, but it's also a really important anti-inflammatory nutrient. It's also high in vitamin A, vitamins B9, folate, and vitamin B12, iron, selenium, phosphorus, and zinc, and it's the #1 food source of copper. But all organ meats are superfoods. And when you compare organ meat to any other food that we could have on our plate instead, keeping in mind that, of course, plant foods have some unique nutrients that we can't get from animal foods. But when you look at a serving of liver versus a serving of steak or an apple or carrots, as this table shows, liver far, far, far outperforms every other food in terms of nutrient density. You really just can't get that level of essential vitamins and minerals in any other food than you can from organ meat. Now, it's important, you know, we talk a lot about liver. Liver is probably the easiest to find organ meat. It is relatively easy to camouflage, to sneak into your diet. It's relatively easy to find in encapsulated form, so you can take organ meat as a capsule and just swallow a pill instead of having to cook it and prepare it and eat it as, you know, they used to in the olden days, liver and onions, for example. But liver is by far the only organ meat available. You know, they're actually, another word for organ meat or offal is variety meats, and they're called variety meats for a reason. There's a huge variety of them. So variety meats include blood, which you might get in, say, blood sausage, bones, for example, making broth or eating marrow, brain, which is admittedly a little bit harder to get in North America, chitterlings and intestines, those are used to make sausage casings, fats and other trimmings, right? Tallow and lard is typically considered a variety meat because it's would be discarded otherwise. Fries, also called Rocky Mountain oysters, which is testicles, a really nutrient-dense organ meat. Heart meat, which we already discussed, which is not just used to be, you can use it to make ground meat, you can eat it straight. There's lots of traditional cuisines that have wonderful preparations of heart, but it can also be used to make things like head cheese. Kidneys, lips actually are a variety meat. Liver, of course, we've mentioned. Melt, which is the spleen. Rinds, which is skin, so for example, pork rinds would be considered a variety meat. Sweetbreads, which is the thymus and the pancreas. Tail, for example, oxtail stew. Tongue, and tripe, which is the stomach. So all of these things are different, perfectly edible, perfectly palatable, even though they may seem, strange and intimidating for you, options when it comes to organ meat. And they all offer different nutrition. So as you're diving into the world of organ meat and trying to add these into your diet, it's okay if something is a strong dislike. When I first started adding organ meat into my diet, I really didn't like kidneys. And I grew to like them. My taste buds adapted, and they've become one of my favorite organ meats over time. But it's okay to experiment with different variety meats to find ones that you like and start at the place where it's something that you aren't intimidated to cook, or you can get in a form that's going to be easy to cook, and that is palatable to you, and start where it is easier to start in terms of that ick factor when it comes to organ meat. So organ meats, as I mentioned, are nutrient powerhouses. They are a complete protein, typically very easily digested complete protein. They tend to be full of healthy fats. They tend to be full of some really important amino acids, and amino acids that can be less abundant in muscle meats. So for example, we can end up being glycine deficient if we overly focus on muscle meats. Organ meats are very, very high in glycine, as is bone broth, which we'll get to in a minute. But these amino acids that are more abundant in organ meat than muscle meats tend to be very important for gut health and immune health. So that's another reason why organ meat is so important. B vitamins of all kinds. B1, B2, B3, B5, B7, B9, B12, biotin, choline, those are all in organ meats in abundance. Vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, vitamin A, but pretty much every vitamin is in organ meats. You get some really impressive minerals as well. So calcium, chlorine, chromium, cobalt, copper, iron, molybdenum, which is really important for detoxification, phosphorus, selenium, zinc. I already mentioned coenzyme Q10. Really important fats like conjugated linoleic acid, which is anti-inflammatory. It's important for metabolism. It reduces cardiovascular disease risk. DHA and EPA, at least when those animals are from, or those organs are from grass-fed animals. Organ meat are nutrient powerhouses, and they really do provide just about everything. The reason why we need plant foods is on top of organ meat is the fiber and the phytochemicals, but those things together just really flood our bodies with nutrients, and that is one of the keys to the autoimmune protocol, is to address those nutrient deficiencies. And of course, different organ meats do have different nutrients, which is another reason why mixing it up is really important. So just like mixing up different vegetables, different color vegetables, starchy and non-starchy vegetables is really important, just like mixing up sometimes sea vegetables, sometimes shellfish, sometimes fish is really important. We see the same thing in organ meat. So with organ meat, we want to be mixing up whatever is accessible to us. And I think the three most common are probably heart, kidney, and liver. But it's not that hard sometimes to find tongue, to find tripe. And when you look at these different organ meats, you can very quickly see when you look at the nutrition facts that when one might not be as strong in one nutrient, you're going to make up for that with another type of organ meat. So mixing it up is really important. Now, I've mentioned broth a few times. Your broth is kind of in this family because it's made from bones and sometimes with the marrow as well as part of the component. And these are a type of offal, right? Bones are not muscle meat. Offal is anything that would normally be thrown out. So it's anything that's not ground beef and steak, pretty much. And broth is a really interesting food because it is a very rich source of some very important amino acids. Now, it also has some mineral content. It is absolutely a myth that bone broth rivals milk in terms of its calcium. But analyses have shown that it does have some calcium, some magnesium, some phosphorus, some potassium, some sodium, a small amount of zinc. And so it can provide us some minerals. It will provide more minerals the longer that it's cooked. So as those bones really start to dissolve into the water that they're simmered in for a long period of time, it will contain more minerals. But it's really, really hard to measure how much of a contribution those minerals have because it's going to be different with every batch of broth. What broth really has to offer that's really, really important is its amino acids profile. And it's particularly high in some really important amino acids from a gut health perspective and from an immune health perspective. So glycine is the star, but we also see that it's high in alanine, arginine, proline, some really exciting amino acids because we tend to not get sufficient quantities when we get overly focused on eating muscle meats, right? When we're overly stuck in our chicken breast and steak and ground beef sort of patterns of dietary choices. So glycine, of course, is the star of bone broth. It is a conditionally indispensable amino acid, which means that it's not considered essential except for in specific circumstances such as illness. But actually, studies have shown that our body really can't keep up with demand. So we can convert other amino acids into glycine, but that conversion is not efficient enough for us to actually rely on that conversion for our glycine needs. So it is really important to get it from diet. So glycine is known to improve sleep quality, enhance memory. It regulates digestion through regulation of bile acid production. It is important in the synthesis of some very extremely important proteins. For example, it is a component of collagen, which is the glue that holds our whole bodies together, but is also a major component of bone and joints and skin. And in fact, glycine, dietary glycine seems to have some anti-aging effects that can actually reverse age-related damage to fibroblasts. So not only does adding glycine to your diet improve skin just from a perspective of providing raw materials for healthy skin for the elastin and collagen that's in skin, but it actually has a direct effect on cell types that are dominant in skin. Glycine is also very important in the innate and adaptive immune systems. So it inhibits macrophage activation. So it actually can stop tissue macrophages from being overly stimulated, which is really important in autoimmune disease. So when you don't have enough glycine, the immune system can get triggered more easily. So it can get ramped up over a much weaker stimulus. And that overactivation, of course, is a major contributor to autoimmune disease. Glycine also can inhibit the activation of several other important immune cell types, so neutrophils, T cells, and monocytes. So you can see that it has a calming effect on both the innate and the adaptive immune system. And animal experiments have actually been able to show that dietary glycine can be protective in various models of inflammation. So we actually have some scientific information showing that just consuming glycine can be anti-inflammatory. Broth has some other really interesting amino acids, though. Glycine may be the star, but there's some other things going on there. So proline is the other amino acid that's often talked about, and in part because, and we'll get to this a little bit next week, but our digestive enzymes are not very good at breaking apart proteins that have a lot of proline in them. So a lot of the problematic proteins in grains and legumes, for example, are proline-rich proteins, and our bodies have a hard time digesting that. Whereas in broth, you're getting broken down proteins already because of that long simmering process. And so this is proline that is much easier for our bodies to absorb, and it is still a very important amino acid. It's also conditionally indispensable, which means it's essential in some conditions and non-essential in others. But it's also a component of collagen, so it is necessary for healthy skin, joints, tendons, the heart, the digestive tract. This connective tissue is so phenomenal because it is not only the structural components of our body, but it is the sort of microscopic glue that holds all of our cells together. Alanine, which is considered a non-essential amino acid, but again, one that we know is phenomenally important and that we do need to get from diet. It's involved in metabolism, and it is known to help improve not just muscle mass. It's a common bodybuilder supplement, but actually it's used in the immune system, and eating enough alanine can help regulate the immune system and help the immune system function normally. Arginine, another conditionally indispensable, so it's essential in some conditions and non-essential in others, is actually essential for cell division, and we know that in immune function it's really important for wound healing. So it can actually control some really important aspects of the innate immune system, and it's also actually important for hormone release. So hormone regulation in general requires arginine. Glutamic acid is the other protein or the other amino acid in bone broth that can be really, really helpful. This one is considered non-essential, but it's actually a very, very important amino acid. It is actually a neurotransmitter, so it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's also key in cellular metabolism. And there's certainly some evidence showing that glutamic acid can help improve overall health through that effect. So let's talk about some myths, because there are a lot of myths surrounding bone broth and organ meat. Now, we've already talked about broth not having as much calcium as milk. That is a common myth, that bone broth is equivalent to milk in terms of mineral content. That's busted. But there's some other ones that I want to go over. So one of the things that you hear is that no one should eat organ meat because it's full of toxins. The liver is full of toxins. The liver is this toxic sponge. That's actually completely untrue. The liver is a filter, so it filters toxins out of our blood, and it processes them. So it has a variety of chemical reactions that it can perform to detoxify these toxins, to render them neutral, and then eliminate them from the body. So it packages them up and either puts them in with bile in the gallbladder to be secreted into our small intestines and eventually excreted in stool. Or if the toxin is water soluble, it'll send it off to the kidneys to be packaged up in urine. So the liver has this amazing ability to detoxify. What it stores is not the toxins it's detoxifying. Those are circulating in our blood and lymphatic systems. What it's storing is all the raw materials that it needs to perform those detoxification reactions. So actually, the best food that you can eat to support your liver's detoxification actions is liver, because it is going to provide all of the raw materials that your liver needs to detoxify. You're not going to be consuming toxins when you consume the liver from an animal. A similar myth that kidneys store urine, so you're eating pee if you eat kidneys, and that's disgusting. And there's all of these food preparations, like soaking kidneys in milk, that are just designed to get rid of the pee in kidneys. Kidneys don't store urine, that's the bladder's job. Kidneys, as they're filtering the blood and produce urine, that urine is immediately shuttled to the bladder. So there's not urine being stored in the kidneys. Again, what the kidneys store is all of the nutrients that it needs to do its job. So a really great food for kidney health is kidneys. Another myth is that organ meats are full of heavy metals and full of other contaminants. This isn't true at all. In fact, studies that have looked at animals that were grown in contaminated sites, so sites that were contaminated due to industrial accidents, for example, and have looked at the heavy metal deposition in different tissues, have shown that there is more heavy metal deposition in muscle tissue than in organ meat. So if you're going to be eating conventional meat, and we don't normally eat meat from animals grown in these contaminated sites, that's not a thing. But if you're even eating conventional meat, you're going to actually reduce your toxic load, which is going to be small to begin with, but you're going to reduce it by consuming more organ meat than more muscle meat. And the same is true with bones. There is some small amount of heavy metals that can sequester in bones, but it's extremely little. So even the bones from conventionally raised animals have a negligible amount of heavy metals. So if you're making broth from those bones, you've got nothing to worry about. You're going to get more heavy metals from the tap water that's being used to make the broth than from the bones themselves. And so that also is important to emphasize this idea that if you can't afford grass-fed or can't source grass-fed organ meat, that you shouldn't eat organ meat. That's false. There are so many tremendous benefits to organ meat that even if you're getting regular old, conventional chicken livers from, I've seen them in my Walmart superstore, even if you're getting, the most conventional options, those are still nutritional powerhouses, and the idea of them having some significant toxins is really a non-issue. Some people believe that you can't use bones that you've saved from cooking to make broth. That's false. So a great free source of bones is the bones from roasting a whole chicken, or that bone in your pork chop or your lamb chop or in the middle of your roast. You can save those, you can freeze them after you have consumed that meal, after they've been cooked, and you can use them to make really delicious broth. So you can absolutely reuse when it comes to broth. There's another myth that broth is full of glutamate. Now, I talked about glutamic acid as being a component of broth. Free glutamate can be a problem for some people as an excitatory neurotransmitter, and free glutamate is the suspected culprit behind MSG sensitivity, although there's a lot of science in the MSG sensitivity field that has really shown no ability to identify a root cause for that sensitivity. So it's sort of considered at least scientifically and medically right now, it's not considered a real sensitivity, although many people have pretty strong reactions. I know MSG sensitivity runs in my family. So just because we don't completely understand it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So in terms of free glutamate in broth, that is also a myth. Adding vinegar to broth, increasing free glutamate, that is also a myth. There is a negligible amount of free glutamate in broth. There is far more in just plain old meat and even some vegetables. So you're actually getting a stronger source of glutamate from other foods. So that is a myth about broth. You can definitely add a little bit of vinegar to broth to help demineralize the bones, although again, that effect is pretty minimal. When you add a tablespoon or two of vinegar to a giant pot of broth, you are very minimally decreasing the pH of that broth. It is a very, very, very weak acid. So another myth, though, and this is one that is the flip side, is a lot of people think that you can skim the fat from the top of making a batch of broth. If you're making it with beautiful beef bones, you might get a ton of tallow rise to the surface. A lot of people think that you can skim that and then use it for cooking. If you skim it right at the beginning of the broth making procedure, then you can do that. But if you're skimming it at the end, that is fat that has been simmering at the air interface, typically for a couple of days for a good homemade bone broth. And that means that it has been at high temperature at air. So it is going to be heavily oxidized. Studies looking at how quickly fats can oxidize would show, anywhere from 10-20% to upwards of half of that fat can be oxidized depending on the exact cooking situation. So definitely eating oxidized fats is not helpful. It can be quite inflammatory. So when you're making your homemade broth, definitely skim the fat. The easiest way to do that is to chill the broth and then skim the fat once it's solidified at the top. So there's a myth that's the other way around. But other than that, it is absolutely safe to eat organ meat, even if you can only source conventional sources. It is absolutely safe to consume broth for everyone, and these are foods that have a tremendous amount of nutrition to offer us. In fact, one of the conversations when it comes to organ meat, of course, is like, how much should I consume? What is a good target? If you look at hunter-gatherers, in times of plenty, they actually will discard the muscle meat and they'll preferentially eat organ meat from their hunted kills. So if you look at it that way, there's no upwards cap. I mean, we see periods of time where hunter-gatherer populations will consume organ meat and gathered plants almost exclusively, and there's no health situations that crop up from that. But if you're looking for a minimum as a target, which most people are concerned with a minimum and not a maximum when it comes to organ meat, you can look at the proportion of the animal that's edible that is organ meat versus muscle meat. And typically we see that somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 by weight of an animal is organ meat compared to muscle meat. If you translate that to, you're eating 21 meals a week, that means you're looking at eating organ meat, say 3 to 5 times a week, assuming there's going to be some seafood in there as well. So I hope I have convinced you that organ meat is a nutritional boon to any diet. Let's talk about ways to make it easier, because I think that's a really important thing to encapsulate here. Heart and tongue are muscles. They're different than skeletal muscles, so they still qualify as organ meat. They're incredibly nutrient dense compared to steak or ground beef, but they do taste a little bit more familiar. So for a lot of people, that's a good place to start. Ground heart meat can be used in place of ground beef, 1-to-1, and it cooks pretty much identically. So that's a really easy starting place for a lot of people. It's important to emphasize here that it is okay to hide organ meat from yourself. So just like you might sneak, some vegetables into something to get more vegetables into your kids, you're allowed to sneak a little liver into your meals to get more liver into yourself. And there's some great ways to do that. So one of the ways that you can do that is by blending ground organ meat with ground muscle meat. And you can do that in whatever ratio you can't taste it. So in my house, I tend to mix 1 pound of ground liver with 2 to 3 pounds of ground beef. And then I use that for making burgers or meatballs or taco meat or whatever it is I'm going to make at home. If you want to start more diluted than that, if you want to start at 1 to 10, I think it'd be incredibly unusual for anyone to be able to taste the liver in that particular situation. So you can start with as little as 10% of your ground meat being ground organ meat. And a really great trick for grinding organ meat is to use a box grater and grate the meat frozen or partially thawed. So stick it in the fridge for an hour out of the freezer before you grate it. And that can make grating a lot of these organ meats really simple. You can also use a home meat grinder or a food processor. There's lots of ways that you can do this. And some butchers sell organ meat grinds already. They'll often sell it for pet food, but only because they see that as the market, not because it's not safe for human consumption. So if you have a butcher near you, you can find out if they do something like that, or they might grind the organ meat for you if you ask. Usually there's a minimum amount to purchase when you do that because of the amount that's lost in the big industrial grinders. Don't get stuck on one type of organ meat. So once you've figured out how to hide liver from yourself, don't stay there. Look at trying to incorporate other types of organ meat. And if you find you just really can't tolerate one type, you taste it no matter how diluted it is, and it's awful to you, pardon the pun, awful, you can move on, right? So if you just really can't figure out how to get liver into your diet, try heart or try kidney or try whatever else you can get at your local farmer's market, or there's great sources for ordering organ meat online as well. You can always try adding the tiniest little bit. Try adding a tiny little cube of frozen liver to a smoothie, for example. You've got a lot of fruit and vegetables in there. You're probably not going to taste it. Try organ meat from different animals. So liver tastes completely different if it comes from pork versus beef versus lamb. Lamb tends to be very mild, pork tends to be very strong, and you may enjoy the liver from one animal and not from another, and that's okay. Figure out which organs you like from which animals. So that's a great self-discovery process to be able to go through. And if all else fails, try encapsulated organ meat. So there are a few companies like Vital Proteins and Dr. Ron's Ultra Pure that are making freeze-dried organ meat in pill form, in capsule form, and you can take anywhere from 3 or 4 to a palmful at a time. You can take them daily. You can take a larger amount a couple times a week. But if you really can't either source organ meat where you live, or you really just can't figure out how to cook it and how to make it so that you don't mind eating it, this is a great solution to be able to consume encapsulated organ meat. And it's a really wonderful tool that we now have that wasn't around a few years ago. So it's a great way to sort of cheat the system here and get more organ meat into your diet. So think about organ meat. Think about ways that you can add that to your life. Your body's going to thank you just because the nutrients in organ meat are so profoundly important for immune health and overall health.